everyone, and welcome to WNYC's The Green Space. My name is Annie Palland. I am the president of the Tenement Museum, and it is an honor to be here, and it is so exciting. This is our third collaboration with WNYC, doing programs like this that kind of take a spark from one of our tours and then come here with and harness it to the amazing storytelling power of WNYC and bring it to you. And I want to first thank all of you because all of you made history. You might not know this, but a few weeks ago, it was a Saturday morning, and WNYC's newsletter came out announcing this program. The Tenement Museum's newsletter came out announcing this program, and all of you, whatever you were doing, maybe you were doing laundry, maybe you were doing shopping, maybe you were just getting out of bed, but somehow all of you saw this announcement, stopped what you were doing, and signed up to come to this program, signing and making this the fastest selling program the Tenement Museum has ever done. I don't know if it's WNYC, so you made history. So just want to acknowledge that. This program tonight is called Peggy Scott's New York. And it's an homage to the amazing character on HBO's hit, The Gilded Age. Peggy Scott's character, played by the remarkable Denee Benton, is an interruption in the way that we typically think about the Gilded Age. So often, when we think about the Gilded Age, we think about a character like Christine Baranski's Agnes Van Ryn, or Bertha, you guys all know her name, Bertha Russell, thank you, played by see, I know this audience. Played by the amazing Carrie Coon. We think about the parvenu and the aristocrat, but we don't usually think about the Gilded Age from the perspective of a journalist from the elite black population of New York City. And so this Peggy Scott character has interrupted our understanding of the Gilded Age, and in doing so, broadened and enlivened, expanded our idea of New York City. And tonight we want to build on that. We want to keep interrupting, and we want to keep expanding our view of New York City because we want to get a sense of what Peggy Scott would think of the tenement districts. Again, with the Gilded Age, we think a lot about the mansions. We think a lot about the brownstones. Tonight, we want to think about it also in relation to the tenements. In other words, what would have been the ties that would have bound a black woman like Peggy Scott to the tenement dwellers, the working class of this very neighborhood? Because this neighborhood that we're in right now, we think of it as Soho, or we think of it as Lower Village, South Village, but it used to be known as the 8th Ward in the 19th century. And the 8th Ward was home to one of the largest free black populations in the country, and certainly in the city. And most of the free black people that lived in this neighborhood lived in tenements. And at the Tenement Museum, we tell the story of one of those families, Joseph and Rachel Moore, who lived at 17 Lawrence, now West Broadway. And we tell that story in our tenement. And you might be wondering, why is that story told at the Tenement Museum? Why isn't it told here in this neighborhood, in their tenement? But their tenement was torn down. It was part of a kind of the expansion of the city, and their tenement was torn down, and they had to relocate, like so many black people that lived in this neighborhood, kind of victim to the growth of the city. And so when we went back to the area where Joseph and Rachel lived, as we were researching their story, we found that there was the Soho Grand Hotel there. And so I guess the Gilded Age has come back down. And so we were so enamored of the story that we thought we had to tell this at the Tenement Museum. And so now what we're going to do tonight is we're going to bring kind of the story of Peggy to life, and to even more life, and expand our story to try to imagine what it would have been like for Peggy to come in contact with the tenement district. And so we're going to learn much more about Peggy's backstory tonight. And we're going to be joined, too, not just by Denee Benton, the actress who plays Peggy, but also Leslie Harris, the extraordinary historian who wrote a book called In the Shadow of Slavery that documents the history of Black New York. So she'll be here tonight, as well as her student, her graduate student, Marquis Taylor. And is Caprice Taylor here tonight? Oh my goodness, so wonderful to meet you. Caprice Taylor is the mother of Marquis Taylor. And Marquis has made the life of the Tenement Museum so much better by doing amazing research on the Joseph and Rachel Moore story and continuing to work with us to keep expanding that story. So he'll be here tonight to share the research he's done in the Black newspapers. And of course, we also have with us tonight the amazing Alison Stewart, the host of WNYC's morning program, all of it. And we're so excited that she's here to help us connect all the dots between uptown and downtown and the past and the present. And again, so excited that you're here as well. I want to thank especially the members of WNYC, the members of the Tenement Museum for helping support our work throughout the year. If you're not currently a member and you want to be part of all of this work, I encourage you to become a member of one of our organizations, or better yet, both of our organizations. But for now, we can unite in welcoming Alison Stewart, who's going to start the program off for us.
Hi, everybody. For joining us here in the green space. Hello to everybody in the audience. Hello to people at home. People in the audience, turn off your cell phones. You don't have to put them away. You can take pictures, put them on Instagram, wherever you want to put them. Hashtag us, and we'll re-hashtag them as well. People at home, you can leave your phones on. I do want to tell you that we are going to go through the program. We'll also have time for questions at the end, so get ready to ask your questions, because we were like, questions, and people, what are we going to ask? Questions. Let's talk about Peggy Scott. Denee Benton has played Peggy since season 1 on The Gilded Age. Broadway lovers, some of you in the house know her as Eliza in Hamilton, or as Natasha and Natasha and Pierre in The Great Comet of 1812, for which she was nominated for a Tony. I saw it twice. Unfortunately, The Gilded Age hasn't had her sing yet. Maybe you can join my personal hashtag Let Peggy Sing. Might happen. Please welcome Denee Benton.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming.
We're so happy to have you.
Yes, happy to be here.
So The Gilded Age was co-founded by Julian Fellowes and Sonia Warfield. When they first presented Peggy to you, what was she presented like in the script?
You know, when I auditioned in 2019, which is crazy to think how long ago that was, Sonia wasn't involved yet. It was a really big part of the push of me and Dr. Erica Dunbar, incredible cohort, and Sally Richardson Whitfield to ask them to expand the writer's room to include a Black woman who could be more adept in really digging into the textures of our story. And so before that, Julian had read this book called Black Gotham, which was Carla Peterson, I believe is her name, was tracking the history of her own family in the 1880s in Black Brooklyn. And she was connected to Philip White, who was a Black pharmacist who owned. And so that's where Julian got the inspiration for this story. But at the time, Peggy still was sort of falling into some stereotypes around what we usually see of Black women on television at that time. Written to be a domestic worker, which no shame in that work. It's work my grandmothers did. There's so much honor in it. And we were like, well, she comes from wealth. Is there room for her to maybe use some of her skills as an educated woman? Can she be a secretary? Can she be working for, a newspaper? And so we got to really expand from what was originally on the page.
I was watching earlier the first season, and I realized Peggy's a bit of a mystery in the first season.
Okay.
Did you have a sense of what her arc would be over the 3 seasons, or did you not know?
No, we've really gone one season at a time. Like at the beginning of season 1, I knew what her secret would be, that she, about her history and her situation with her family. But to be honest, it's because of all of you that we've kept getting more seasons, because each season we've sort of thought maybe it was our last. And so every year we've kind of gotten to come back with a fresh, exciting start.
That's exciting for you. You
Truly.
never know which way she's going.
Yeah, it's exciting, and we're mostly just like, oh my God, I have a job, thank you.
Spoken as a true actress.
Yes, exactly.
You mentioned Erica Armstrong Dunbar.
Yes.
She's a great historian and professor, and she co-produced the show, and largely she is responsible for accuracy, especially around Black characters. What questions did you have for her about how Peggy would move through the world?
I think there are a lot of moments where we get to see the dignity that she moves with, but I think that Dr. Dunbar always does a really good job at reminding us just how life and death every moment really was. Like, to offend a white person in that time, and this time, unfortunately, with where we are now. But at that time, it really was every moment that you chose to speak up for yourself or you chose to challenge anything. So the spaces Peggy's moving through and the code switching she does, she always is walking this very specific tightrope. And that was really helpful. The history of Black journalism at that time is really exciting. It was such a centering point for like every region around the country. And they would host read-ins where they would teach different members of the community who had just been emancipated or were a generation away how to read, and different, there was like a real, there was obviously still classism, but there was a sense of responsibility for one another, and also still some of the same issues we face today around that type of separation. And so she was just she is such a rich resource and was a big part. I don't know if I'm skipping ahead to any of your questions, but was a huge, her vision for T. Thomas Fortune was a really big gift to our show, because originally Peggy was going to write under a white pen name for a white newspaper. And Dr. Dunbar was like, there was a Black newspaper that existed, so what if we just have her write for the Globe? And so those moments were just priceless.
What was something that she told you that really surprised you?
Ooh. That's such a good question. Something that surprised, this is going to be boring, but I think that like moments like why it was such a big deal that Thomas Fortune showed up at the train station to ride with Peggy unmarried. Like you just, as a woman at that time, there were just so many restrictions around how you were allowed to be seen in public. So anyone finding out that a single unmarried woman was riding with this married man on a train, boss or not, it's without a chaperone, all of those things could just like damage you forever. Everything, the stakes were so high.
I wanted to ask you about a relationship early in the season between Marion Brooke and Peggy. Marion's played by Louisa Jacobson, the niece of the wealthy widows who you live with. And it's interesting because how did you discuss about whether they would have a friendship, or could they actually have a friendship?
Yeah, you know, originally the infamous shoe scene that everyone talks about, Marion and the shoes.
Do you know what this is about, the Marion and the shoes? Okay, so Marion shows up at her house in Brooklyn with a bag of shoes to give the family, like, oh, you might need shoes.
Yeah.
And she was wrong.
She was wrong. It's actually the scene that I still get stopped on the street about. Like,
really?
people are obsessed with it. And then she brought those shoes. They love it. And, you know, originally it was written for Peggy to be really understanding and not and Marion to apologize and Peggy to forgive her really quickly. And Louisa and I really advocated. We were like, we're only going to see a true friendship build between them if we allow this rupture to happen and like allow this trust to be broken and allow Peggy to really put Louisa's character in her place, Marion in her place. And how Marion responds to that as a white woman in that time will tell Peggy everything she needs to know about whether or not they can actually be friends or if this is just a nice acquaintance, you know? And so us really allowing that moment to be heated and how dangerous it was for Peggy to raise her voice at her was something we really advocated for. And it's exciting because I think the way Marion responds in time, we as an audience believe that they could become friends as these sort of two. They get to be these like secret keepers for each other because all of their relationship really exists in the comfort of that home. And they get to build a true bond in time. But we really wanted to fight for that moment to be earned.
So you think by the third seasons they are friends?
Yeah. I think by season 3, I think by the time Peggy tells Marion about her past, that's like such an act of trust. I think Marion they tell each other their secrets and they don't move in the same circle, so no one's at risk of the gossip, you know?
Education is a clear part of Peggy's background. She attended the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. It was a Quaker school that taught blacks to read and to write. It kind of gets her in with Agnes in the beginning a little bit. How does education play a part in her life?
I mean, I think that at that time, it was the key to any kind of upward mobility, you know? And so I think for her family to be able to afford to send her away, obviously it's why she gets to have skills as a writer. Yeah, I mean, it opens the door to her entire world to get to move. And at that time, being a professional woman, period, was like a class that didn't really exist yet. There were like working class women, and then there were wealthy married women. And so Peggy, as a woman and then as a Black woman, sort of represents this new type of woman at that time who got to be a young professional.
We're all rooting for Peggy. Everybody roots for Peggy. But to your point, there's racism, there's colorism, there's classism around every corner. Which of these areas is it the hardest for you as a 21st century woman to deal with?
You know, I feel like people were really touched by the colorism aspect that we explored last season. And I was as well, because even as an actor auditioning for this role, when I read it on the page, I kind of assumed they would cast a light-skinned actress or cast someone who was mixed or who fit that kind of beauty standard in a different way. And so I think I was really excited that we were going to explore that and get into those textures with the Kirklands and Newport. And so I found that to almost feel more charged than some of the other scenes because it's so inside of our community, you know?
Your parents, Dorothy, Audra McDonald, and Arthur Scott, John Douglas Thompson, they live in Brooklyn.
Yes.
Do you have a place in your mind where they live?
Yeah, I sort of imagine. I mean, Weeksville was a historical Black neighborhood, which I believe was like Dumbo area. And then, so I sort of imagine some of Dumbo, and then sometimes I imagine more of like a Fort Greene, Brooklyn Heights, all of those neighborhoods were historically Black. I also didn't know that so much of the West Village was historically Black, and those houses around Washington Square Park. And obviously from Harlem to Central Park, we just sort of have kept getting pushed south. But yeah.
How has it changed Brooklyn for you?
I feel, I live in also a historically Black part of Brooklyn, and I think I feel an honor, and I also feel a kind of grief about how that story keeps repeating itself.
Yeah.
And, I read some statistic that in the last 10 years, Bed-Stuy and Harlem have lost over 30,000 residents in each neighborhood, Black residents, because of the rent crisis. And I'm like, oh, in another 50 years, will someone be writing a story resurrecting this Black community in the way that we're doing for our show? And hopefully they will be able to hold on to parts of it. But that is something I think a lot about, that kind of repetition.
I'd like to bring on our historians, if that's okay with you. Leslie Harris is a renowned scholar and history professor at Northwestern University and advisor to the Tenement Museum. Come on up. Her books include In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863, and Marquis Taylor, who is a lead researcher at the Tenement Museum for a Union of Hope exhibit and is working on a PhD in African American history from Northwestern. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
It's nice to see you again.
Good to see you.
I wanted you to comment on the area of Brooklyn that the Scotts would have lived in. Where do you think they would have lived? What would
I
it have
think
been like?
Weeksville, that's exactly what came to mind as well. Weeksville was an independent Black community, Black homeowners, businesses, and that fits very well. But the other thing about Brooklyn at this time, and Blacks in New York at this time, we think a lot about residential segregation, but Black people didn't live in isolated pockets. So Weeksville is kind of unique in that way. So it's very likely, as you said, that they lived among other people, immigrants, white people, in Brooklyn Heights or in other places in Brooklyn. So it was actually, in a funny way, more integrated because Black people, when they lived in these places, the city did not contain them in that way. The other thing I want to say, though, about why there's so many black people in Brooklyn in this time and why they may have been there is that they were pushed out of Manhattan by the 1863 draft riots. And so there are people who, there's a big drop in the population after the draft riots, and there are people who say, I crossed the river into Brooklyn and I swore I'd never go back to Manhattan after that horrible days of rioting. It's a very, yeah. So that's another, before this time period, that's another big push into Brooklyn of African Americans.
Marquis, we're sitting in Soho. This would have been the 8th ward. Are we going to see on the screen? I think we might see a little bit. There we are, 17 Lawrence Street. You can probably figure out where we are. Would you describe the 8th ward for us at this time?
Yeah, certainly. And thank you for your question. So between the 1850s and the 1870s, for the black people who remained on the island of Manhattan, nearly 45% of them were living in this western corridor of Manhattan. So that is Lower Manhattan's 8th Ward, where we are currently standing today, but the neighborhood also just south of that, which we knew at this time as the 5 Points, and a neighborhood directly north of the 8th Ward, which was known at the time as Little Africa, which we now know today as Greenwich Village. And in these neighborhoods at this time, Black New Yorkers are routinely supporting Black businesses in different forms of institutions, such as churches. A lot of the storied Black churches that now are in Harlem actually had their origins in the 8th Ward, and if not in the 8th Ward, right in Little Africa. So when we think about places like Abyssinian Baptist Church or St. Philip's Episcopal Church or Bethel AME Church, these institutions were actually born and created in the 8th Ward and the surrounding areas. And so this neighborhood was also not solely a neighborhood that was occupied by Black people. Both Black and Irish people lived in this community together. And so about 15% of Irish immigrants lived in this neighborhood alongside Black New Yorkers.
And that was actually in the show.
Yes,
Wasn't
the
it,
Sarah
right?
Garnett. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, season 2, when they're saving the public schools, one of the ways that they are able to do it is by integrating them with Irish students. It's what the city allowed for them to keep the schools going. And Sarah Garnett's house is in the West Village.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
What was life like, Marquis? Daily life like?
Well, within the 8th Ward, a big part of what is ordering people's daily life is work and labor. So the neighborhood is mostly working class at this time. So at the Tenement Museum, we tell the story of both Joseph and Rachel Moore, who are a Black couple who lived in New York City during this time period. And Joseph, his labor was very emblematic of the work that Black men were performing at the time. He was both a waiter and he also was a coachman. And those are the two highest jobs that Black men, working class Black men, occupied at this time. His wife, Rachel, on the 1870 census says that she was keeping home, which meant that she was ordering the home and the daily life there. But we also know from other records that she was also a washerwoman, which is a common profession for Black women at this time. So people are working, but people are also coming together in community. And a lot of that is happening, like I said, within the churches, but then also too within the school system as well, which is a big part of life in the 8th Ward at this time.
Leslie, what issues did Black people face in the North, especially around this time, sort of post-Reconstruction, sort of during the Redemption period?
So it's mixed. So post-Reconstruction, really post-Civil War, there's a strong movement, migration from the South to places like New York, to the North, where people think they can have more opportunity. There's some intra-racial tension with the Black Knickerbockers, as they're called, who sort of look at this, many of these people who are newly out of enslavement, and they have questions about whether or not they can survive and thrive in New York. Are they going to be good laborers? Some of the assumptions that people have are Black people have them too, that people have about Southern slaves, Northern Blacks have them too. And of course we see that a little bit in this last season on the Gilded Age. There continues to be racism, there continues to be a shift of movements of Black people, and as immigration, European immigration increases, and as elites are trying to shape Lower Manhattan, this is where you begin to get the movement north of Black people, out of the 8th Ward, first into what we would now call, I think, the meat packing district for a while, and then finally up into Harlem. Those kinds of pressures are definitely there. This is why these churches move, and there's a moving photograph. I think it's of Abyssinian, like that final photograph in front of their building right before they're leaving. So that constant movement is definitely part of the experience. One more thing that happens, and this gets to someone like Peggy's family, is that some middle-class Black people do create these reform groups. Women especially are trying to protect what they see as young women coming from a rural area to an urban area, and they want them to be safe, quote unquote, not to get into trouble in all the ways that they meant in the late 19th century, the things you were talking about, to instill morality, and so that becomes a big part of the Black community at this time.
Can I ask you, when you say the elites, what do you mean when you keep saying the elites?
Right. Educated, perhaps multi-generational. I would say for me, there are people, now when I say elite, I'm not saying like they're super wealthy, although there are some property owners and we don't know enough about them. I was on a panel at the Schomburg several years ago, and in Little Africa, there are some quite, you'd be surprised, quite wealthy property owners. They own multiple apartment buildings, et cetera. Their names are not, even to me, coming to my mind, which tells you how buried they are in the history. But it's mostly thinking about people who started newspapers, who started churches, who saw themselves as having an experience and an understanding of uplift, and that they really wanted this community, and they saw themselves as tied to whether or not this community could thrive and survive, because racist ideas were always waiting there to crush them as well. So elite in the sense that they took on a very conscious leadership role. Now, that's us looking back. Yeah. We can ask whether or not working class people always wanted that kind of imposition or reform, and that's not always the case.
What do you think, Marquis? Did they?
Yeah. You find oftentimes that, to Dr. Harris's point, that people are sort of working in tandem to advance certain goals within the Black community at times, but then also that it can also be antagonistic as well. So there's definitely this sort of intra-racial class distinction that is taking shape at this time.
Denée, Peggy writes for the New York Globe. It was a Black paper at the time, as you mentioned, T. Thomas Fortune, a real person. How much did you get into studying the Black press?
You know, I've gotten to read a lot of articles from the Globe, which was exciting. I think what is cool about Peggy's character is that her father was emancipated, and T. Thomas Fortune was also born into slavery in Florida, and he learned about the press in Florida before migrating up north. And so I think between like reading some of Ida B. Wells' writing at that time, it was really the Black press was the center of all movement work between that and the church, and how everyone really gathered any kind of information. And so like silencing the press would have real ramifications, and keeping it going was like how they got out the word about saving the 3 Black public schools in New York City or in Brooklyn, you know? So it was more than, this is what's happening today. It had such a huge, vital importance.
Marquis, tell me how the Black press helped you in your research.
The Black press has been indispensable to the research that I've done. I mean, it's been super, super helpful for us to get a really good understanding of the aims and priorities of Black New Yorkers at this time. So much of what is out there in sort of the dominant narrative about Black New Yorkers in particular neighborhoods, even like the 8th Ward, is covered by newspapers like the New York Times or the New York Herald, which talks about this neighborhood as being filled with crime, vice, and degeneracy. But the Black newspapers instead provide a perspective that is Black-centered and allows us to see the different businesses and institutions that were in the community at this time. At the Tenement Museum, we talk a lot about the different businesses that were there. There were women like Ann Magnin, who was a Black woman who worked at Colored School No. 2, and she taught students Spanish guitar and piano from her tenement apartment at 154 Sullivan Street. We learned about women like Madam Johnson, who owned an ice cream parlor, and that was something that was really important as a community institution, because there were people like William Butler, who was a Black pastor at the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, who talked about the embarrassment that he experienced by some days being able to go to an ice cream parlor, a white-owned ice cream parlor, and other days not being able to get serviced, right? And so the Black newspapers clearly talk about the institutions that are there, but then also they do the work of correcting what mainstream non-black newspapers are saying about black people at this time.
Leslie, we've all heard of Ida B. Wells. Who are some other names that we should know of?
Well, first of all, you should know that New York City is the founding of the black press is here. 1827, Freedom's Journal, and it is political in the ways that have been described because that was exactly the purpose in founding it for these reasons. We have to plead our own cause, is what Samuel Cornish said on the masthead. Moving forward, and at this time period that we're talking about, post-Civil War, one of the amazing things that happens with, as we've heard, formerly enslaved people and people who were free is this incredible flowering of the black press. Newspapers, but also churches are publishing magazines and journals. Books, there are black presses that are publishing black books. Some of the people from this time, we already mentioned T. Thomas Fortune, who's one of the leaders. There's a woman, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who founds the Woman's Era, which is the first newspaper for black women. Gertrude Bastel, I'm forgetting her last name, who is a model for Peggy, who also writes for T. Thomas Fortune. And the other thing I would say is that there are papers in every corner. In San Francisco, there's the Elevator and the Pacific Appeal. In New Orleans, my hometown, there's French newspapers that are founded during the Civil War and Reconstruction, as well as English language newspapers. And then early 20th century, 1905, is Chicago Defender, which is still, so not to mention the New York Amsterdam News and all of these papers. So it is an incredible resource. It is something communities pour money and resources into, and I think it's still important today. It tells another story that no one else tells.
Peggy has an assignment to go to Alabama to visit the Tuskegee Institute. What did that storyline about Alabama and about Tuskegee open up for Peggy on the show, and open up for the show, period?
Yeah, I think that getting into any kind of diasporic relationship, even inside of our own country and inside of her own intersectional experience with her wealth and with being just like, she's a city girl, and then we see her go down and milk a cow. And she's like, oh my God, ew, and it's like seeing the differences between all those moments I thought were really delightful. And also seeing Peggy confront her own privilege and seeing that, oh, I do have a different kind of access to power, access to wealth, and seeing her mom really warn her about how different it was going to be. And Peggy kind of having a little bit of a chip on her shoulder and then getting really faced with the realities. So I think getting to move to Tuskegee, getting to see Newport, getting to see New York, we really are... It feels like a small act of resistance to any kind of monolithic narrative of what blackness looked like at that time. And yeah, I think that Peggy's relationship to class is interesting. Also, the man that she marries first, the reason her father breaks it up is his own classism and it's so interesting how quickly your upward mobility can turn into classism, even though where he came from, but he wanted more for his daughter, and those definitions and interesting pathways into success, which I think is what Booker T. Washington was trying to create at Tuskegee Institute, and looking at those arguments in the black community of whether or not to give people professional access or working class access. And, all those arguments are kind of the same today.
Yeah, it was so interesting because it brought up the argument of the Booker T. Washington argument and the W.B. Du Bois argument.
Yes.
The two different groups. I heard that. Leslie, would you explain what the difference is for people who don't know?
Yeah, so Booker T. Washington is a former slave, and if any of you have read Up from Slavery, you know that he describes being a child in the last days of slavery, and he literally walks to Hampton University to gain his education. And Hampton at that time was a place that took any African-American person who wanted an education. And so for him, building Tuskegee was a way to educate anyone from any level all the way through. Students at Tuskegee built the buildings, they cooked the food, they did everything. And so that was a very much an institution that was geared with giving people practical skills. W.B. Du Bois, went to Germany went to Harvard and then went to Germany to get his PhD. It was a very different path. I don't know that he ever walked barefoot to school. And so there is, for a long time, historians have seen those two visions as opposed. Booker T. Washington gave this famous speech in which he said, blacks and whites can be as the fingers of one hand. We're together, but we're separate. And so that was seen at the time in the 1890s as appeasing segregationists. And that was a rift, of course, with what would become the NAACP, which was all about fighting segregation. At the same time, Booker T. Washington was very, very savvy. He knew how to get money out of the elites in this town and every other town. And so there's a little bit of, he's sometimes called the Wizard of Tuskegee for that reason.
Let's play a clip from the Gilded Age. In this scene, this sets up sort of the black woman's role in the community and teaching with journalism, and a larger point of that there are struggles to face in the North as there were in the South. This clip features Peggy, her mother, an activist, Sarah Garnett.
In short, we must work together. Please join us in showing your support by signing the petition to stop the board. Thank you. Look who I brought. Aren't you a sight for sore eyes?
It's so nice to see you again, but I'm sorry it's under these circumstances.
I am as well.
If we stay determined, they won't win.
It's an uphill battle. Some of the teachers are already looking for new jobs. I have the seamstress shop, but that won't be enough to make a living if the schools close.
Organizing this meeting is a good first step.
But it's not enough.
You know, Peggy has an important piece coming out in the Globe about Booker T. Washington's school in Tuskegee.
Mother.
I was just thinking, this could be your next article. First, she wrote about education in the South, but we face our own challenges here in the North.
That's exactly what we need. Public exposure. Some folks don't even know this is happening. We need parents and colored businesses and the press to fight this together.
What do you say?
It does sound like something my editor would be interested in. But I have to speak with him first.
Whatever you can do, Peggy, we'd be most appreciative.
I think your editor's going to be interested.
I think so.
First of all, how long does it take you to get dressed? We'll talk about the serious stuff, but how long does it take you to get dressed for that?
You'd be surprised. We've gotten very quick. We get in and out for lunch. We're like, get me free.
I just had to ask. Leslie, will you tell us who Sarah Garnett is?
So Sarah Garnett is this fascinating woman who lives through so much change. She's born in 1831. She lives through the Civil War. When we see her there, I have to mention that her sister, Susan McKinney Stewart, is one of the first African-American doctors, women doctors as well. When we see her at that point, she's a teacher, principal of one of the color school, number 5, I think. Anyway, she is also the wife of Henry Highland Garnett, who himself had escaped slavery with his family and is a very fiery anti-slavery activist in the pre-Civil War period. And in fact, he and Douglass part ways. This is a second marriage for them both at this period of time. So she's a leader. She also is a suffragist. She is definitely a force in that community. And many of the women like her who are teachers, who are principals, who are educators. It's one of the, it's a good job if you can keep the school open and funded. So definitely a leader and just influences a lot of children. It's a very important thread in the Black community here.
Marquis, this is a place where we should mention Fanny Tompkins. She was related by marriage to Sarah Garnett. Could you explain a little bit about Fanny Tompkins?
Yes, and so Fanny Tompkins and Sarah Garnett are connected from Sarah Garnett's first marriage to Fanny Tompkins' brother. So that's how the two of them are connected. They're sister-in-laws. And Fanny Tompkins, like Sarah, Tompkins Garnett was also an educator. She spent nearly 4 decades laboring in New York City as a teacher, first with the African Free School System, which is a set of private schools for black students, and then she eventually makes her way into the colored school system, which is a public set of institutions. And most notably, she works at Colored School Number 2, which is situated right here in this neighborhood on what is now West Broadway. And she served as principal of that school, and I think in a lot of ways she's the embodiment of how education had profound implications for, of course, teaching students, but also teaching students about the real world. And so in 1859, just after John Brown has his insurrection on Harper's Ferry, what she actually does is that she has, under her direction, she has her students perform an oratorio of Joseph, which is a story that basically exposes this idea that how can Christians hold other Christians who are black and, in slavery, right? And so she's having her students do this type of work, and they raise money and they give the money to the widows of John Brown's insurrection. And so Fanny Tompkins, just like her sister-in-law Sarah Tompkins Garnett, is someone who inspired, I'm sure, hundreds, if not thousands of students within New York City over the 4 decades in which she labored here. And she also was acutely aware of the limitations of her students, in the sense of she was a part of a concert of black educators who petitioned the city to start a colored night school for black students, realizing that some students' families needed their labor during the day and wanted to create different opportunities for them. So in my eyes, Sarah Tompkins and Fanny Garnett, they're very influential women.
Would you say, is being a teacher, was that the ultimate goal for a woman, a black woman at that time?
I don't know if it was the ultimate. I mean, again, we have, Peggy, who wants to be a
Journalist.
reporter, and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who has her own magazine. It certainly is an acceptable role. So
Yeah.
that's I think, and again, it's a way to serve. But then her sister is a doctor. So, we don't know what
Yeah.
more dreams people would have had, but just were limited. I mean, to be even a woman, much less a black woman doctor, is a huge achievement at that time.
Marquis, most of the women who lived in the Eighth Ward, what did they do with their time? Were they mothers? Were they washerwomen? Were they teachers? What did they do with their days?
And so most of the women living in the Eighth Ward largely were washerwomen. You also have some women who were teachers, like Fanny Tompkins lived in the Eighth Ward as well. So the neighborhood was, you had a mix of people who were doing in some ways like professional work, but they were largely washerwomen. And that's the second highest, the second most occupied job for black women at this time, being a washerwoman.
Denee, you have something you're going to read for us.
Yes, it was on a stand right there. Okay, great.
Right now. This was actually printed in Frederick Douglass's paper. It was a series by James McCune Smith, and it was about working class jobs, and this was called The Washerwomen. Denee Benton.
The Washerwoman by James McCune Smith. Heads of the Color People, number 3. Saturday night, dunk goes the smoothing iron, then a swift gliding sound as it passes smoothly over starched bosom and collar and wristbands of one of the many dozen shirts that hang round the room on horses, chairs, lines, and every other thing capable of being hanged on. Dunk, dunk goes the iron, sadly, wearily, but steadily, as if the very heat of toil were throbbing in its penultimate beats. Dunk, dunk, and that small and delicately formed hand and wrist swell up with knotted muscles and bursting veins, and the eye and brow chiseled out for stern resolve and high thought, the one now dull and haggard, and the other seamed and blistered with deep furrows and great drops of sweat wrung out by overtoil. The apartment is small, hot as an oven, the air in it thick and misty, with the steam rising from the ironing tables in the corners, under the tables, and in all out-of-the-way places are stowed tubs of various sizes, some empty, some full of clothes soaking for next week's labor. On the walls hang pictures of old Pappy Thompson or Brother Paul or Sammy Cornish. In one corner of the room, a newly varnished mahogany table is partly filled with books. Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, Watt's Hymns, The Life of Christ, and a nice greasy novel just in from the circulating library. Between the windows stands an old bureau, the big drawer of which is the larder, containing sundry slices of cold meat, secondhand toast with butter on it, and the carcass of a turkey, the return cargo of a basket of clothes sent downtown that morning. But even this food is untasted, for the Sabbath approaches, and the old Zion and the vivid doses of hellfire ready to be showered from the pulpit on all who do labor, saving the parson, who does pound the reading board in a style which to the unsanctioned looks like hard work on the day of rest. The washerwoman.
And Ryan, Chelsea, I'm going to tell you to get your mics ready because we're going to come into questions next in a minute. Leslie, tell us about the history of that piece.
So James McCune Smith was the first black doctor in the United States. He had to go to Scotland, to the University of Glasgow, to obtain his degree. It's possible that he was writing about his own experience with his own mother, so that's a possibility. Even though he was one of the most highly educated men in New York, he always had a special touch for working class people, and so he did this series, Heads of the Colored People, about working class black New Yorkers. You can hear how hard that work is when she says her veins popped out. I mean, these are women who carry wet clothing, scrub. It is a kind of labor that we don't see very much of today, given our technology. But it also gives them independence. They're not in someone else's house. They can work with other people. They can keep house if they have young children. And so they have to weigh those things. And of course, it's one of the jobs they can have. The other one, I'm assuming the top one, is domestics. You said it's a second. So domestics might have to live in, might be away from their family more. One other thing I can't not say is that you heard that there's the carcass of the turkey, and that might be left over from one of her clients. And I happened to hear a speech by the now late Reverend Jesse Jackson discussing how on Thanksgiving Day they always had their dinner after his mother had cooked Thanksgiving dinner for the family she worked for. And he was talking about getting his turkey and stuffing later. So hearing that was... So I just want to invoke that this was continued well into the 20th century, this kind of labor and laboring for other people in that way, for working class black people.
Let's take a few questions from the audience. Come on down.
Thank you. This has been excellent. Thank you so much. My question's for Denée. So as professional black women, even in the 21st century, there's many more of us, but we face certain challenges. And I was just wondering, drawing inspiration from Peggy, do you ever think, what would Peggy do as you go through your life?
Oh my gosh, yes. That was like my mantra for the first season, actually, because I feel like we were going through our Saturn returns at the same time, if anyone knows what that is.
Yes.
When you're like emerging into adulthood and your life falls apart. And I was going through that personally while playing Peggy season 1, and I would be like in my dressing room having some breakdown and be like, if Peggy can do it, I can do it. We got this. And so what would Peggy do definitely stays with me.
Oh, that's a Gilded Age t-shirt if I've ever seen one. Oh my
Absolutely.
God.
Make the merch, people.
Who else had a question? There's a lady right here and a gentleman back there.
Hi, how are you? First of all, it's such an honor to have you all three here. And my question is for the three of you. And thank you so much. It's a delight to speak with you. So it's a little bit different of the topic that we have talked in the last couple of minutes and hour. So I'm really interested in exploring basically the history of immigration, especially in New York, because we know that it's a huge topic, especially today. So I would like to know if you can tell me a little bit more about immigration in the Gilded Age, and if basically what was the role that they play in the Gilded Age, and especially for Denée, what role did they play in shaping the city? I'm so sorry. I'm going to say that again. So I have 3 questions specifically. First, can you tell me about the immigration population in New York during the Gilded Age? The second is, what role did they play in shaping the city? And the third is, if there is any connection between this era and what is happening in immigration policies today, and if there is going to be maybe an operation or maybe a little piece in the future in the Gilded Age in immigration policies and basically what is happening. Thank you.
You want to start?
So to talk about, and at least thinking about within the Black community at this time, during the Gilded Age, we're going to see a surge of Black immigrants coming to the United States, primarily from the Caribbean at this time. So between 1890 and about 1915, we're going to see the rates of Black immigrants increase. And a lot of that has to do with the interests of the United States and a lot of these different Caribbean countries. So we know that the United States has recently annexed Puerto Rico. There's all this sort of migration that's happening across the Caribbean, largely because I would say during the Gilded Age, it's a time of amass wealth, but for people who are not wealthy, they're suffering from economic exploitation. And so you see that in places like New York, there is an increase of people who are coming from places like Puerto Rico, places like St. Kitts and St. Croix. They're immigrating all across the Caribbean looking for work, and they ultimately make their way to New York. And this will even extend a little bit beyond the Gilded Age until the 1930s, so much so that in a place like Harlem, about a third of its Black community are people who are newly arrived to this country and a part of that sort of immigration trajectory.
And I would say more generally, of course, we are in another moment of desperately needing the labor of immigrants and now demonizing. And so that was definitely not only for these immigrants, but for, of course, the massive European immigration that comes in the same time period. And so, it's shameful. We need more people to be aware, not just aware of the history, but to actually realize the contribution of all of these immigrants. And that's just an ongoing struggle. And then we have people who are the children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren of immigrants who are now calling to stop immigration, or who are themselves immigrants. So I won't go any further, but I think you get my drift. So, pendulum, but I will say when I'm feeling hopeful that more people than ever before recognize the enormous contributions that immigrants have made. And unfortunately, we had to get to the point we did, but the events in Minneapolis, people are really exercised. And I think that we just have to keep pushing back against all of this ridiculousness. Lies. I mean, you can look at newspapers from this time, the same lies about Chinese immigrants, about Jewish people, about Germans, about Italians, you name it. You're not like us. You're different. You drink too much. You Irish. You do this, that, da, 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 da. Constant. So we're back there. Boring.
Yeah, I'm even really interested in the language of immigrant and who we imagine when we say that word, because obviously the Van Ryns, everyone that they descend from, were white immigrants who came here and took land from native people who we now call immigrants. It's all, and it happened in every faction of this country of America, and then South America, Central America. And so our language is really twisted. And I'm also interested in the fact that during this time, Black people were still called Africans. It was the Free African School. It was the Free African Church. Like, we hadn't even been embraced into the concept of what it meant to be American yet. And the regional fugitivity of coming from the South to coming to the North, and the relationship to the Great Migration that would happen later. Like, I do feel like Black people within this nation have a relationship to being fugitives from different regions and having to run from terrorism. And, obviously you're not an immigrant when you were brought here by force, but there was a migration across the Atlantic. And so I think it's really interesting. Like, I wonder when Peggy or Peggy's parents, like, when they thought of themselves as Americans, if, like, when that consciousness shifted, or if you still thought of yourself as an African on this land. And so, yeah, it's all, the language is all so screwed because this country is just hell-bent on getting free labor, and it's like the way our economy's popped up. So anytime one group of people escapes its grips, the, like, Leviathan monster turns and tries to trap another group to try to get some more free labor. And, you know, there's enough for all of us, but these, I don't know, 10 scary billionaires are just really hell-bent on not letting it change.
I think there was a gentleman in the back who had a question.
My question is for whoever thinks they have the best answer. But I remember watching The Gilded Age in the first season, and I think Marion and Peggy were walking in what was supposed to be Madison Square Park, and there was a lot of people around. And I just remember thinking, would people have thought this was normal? Would people have reacted to it? Would either Marion or Peggy have felt insecure about the situation? Or was it at a point where people were just used to interracial friendships and general interactions?
Well, that's a great question. I'd have to think about it a little bit, but I'll say this. In the antebellum period, if you were walking in that way as they were as friends, you would almost certainly be called an abolitionist, and you could be attacked. So Frederick Douglass is walking with, I think it's Julia Griffiths, who is a white British anti-slavery activist who's visiting the city. They're there for the American Anti-Slavery Society meetings, and they're attacked physically. And many other white abolitionists walking with black people as colleagues and friends get attacked throughout the U.S. So that's one history. I don't think that necessarily has ended by this time period, by the 1880s. I think the threat, because Peggy would look almost, you know, middle class, maybe not as well dressed, but very close to as well dressed as Marion, that would be seen as odd, perhaps threatening. I wouldn't be surprised if they got like people talking to them or say, who are you, or why are you with her? Maybe not physical attacks, but I would expect that they would hear some chatter, actually.
There's a scene where you're with your dad and you're discussing and you're walking and a white couple comes up to you and you and your father step back.
Yes.
Yes, and there's also a scene in season 1 where Marion's sort of oblivious and takes Peggy with her to this sort of Saks type store. And Peggy is like, girl, why did you bring me here? Like, you know, I can't. Right. And so you see them
Like,
kind
can
of.
we go?
Right. And so Dr. Dunbar was also a part of, like, Peggy would walk behind Marion in that circumstance. And the frustration, I think, with Peggy of being put in that position. And,
because walking behind her would indicate she was her servant.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
That's another issue for them, yeah.
Oh, hi. Hello over there.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks again. This is great. I'm curious about the kind of fractured media environment you're describing with all of these newspapers springing up, like regionally and ethnically and racially and politically, all representing different causes. Sounds so familiar to kind of a media environment now. So I have kind of two questions. One, which is how journalists think of themselves changed from a kind of advocate for a cause to a, you know, this kind of objectivity kind of thing that is hard to achieve. And also, do you feel as though was there conspiracies being kind of thrown around more liberally back then, and also now, do we maybe underrate the benefits of that fractured media so that it can kind of lift up voices that wouldn't be heard otherwise?
Yes. All of that. It is funny to be in the journalism moment we're in now, because when you look at the 19th century, I mean, newspapers are very politically tied to different causes. I haven't even mentioned the anti-slavery press, which is very closely tied to the black press, but they're also very different. And objectivity in the way we think of it, that's really a 20th century thing. I recently read a New York Times op-ed by Lydia Polgreen, who's an excellent journalist, and she gives this thumbnail sketch of journalism, and she says, you know, she was responding to Jeff Bezos's whatever of the Washington Post. But she said, you know, with the way the Washington Post situated itself in opposition with Watergate, we entered this kind of golden age of journalists really being advocates for the truth, not for particular positions. And now we're seeing that crumble in the legacy media, but it's rising up in this other place, I think. And so I personally kind of find it exciting to have all of the fracturing. It doesn't feel like fracture, it feels like patchwork. It feels like pastiche. It is, and there's more space. And I think even though it was a struggle for Blacks to find the money to do their newspapers, it did mean that they could in a way that's different. So I don't know. It's exciting. It is scary, though, because we are so used. But, I grew up with ABC, NBC, CBS, and maybe a little PBS. And that was pretty narrow, as in terms of journalism. The one piece that we are missing, though, is local journalism. And that is really, but there's some nonprofits that are trying to pick that up. So I would say support local nonprofits for your, state and city stuff. Just saying.
What was the decision like to portray T. Thomas Fortune and his relationship with Peggy?
Yes. It was tricky. I think originally they were hoping for a big love story arc, and then Dr. Dunbar was like, wait, he was married. She kind of was able to flag that. And so instead we got to play with this kind of intellectual tension between them and the spark that goes. And T. Thomas Fortune sort of had a tragic ending. He, I think, dealing with a lot of the PTSD from his life, had a pretty severe drinking addiction by the end. But we could only take it so far. But I was, people have their different opinions. I was kind of happy we got to see Peggy's passionate bad girl side.
Definitely.
In Tuskegee,
It was great.
It was great.
You have time for a couple more?
Good evening. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful so far. Thank you. When I think of this time, I think of sadly, a lot of extrajudicial violence against Black people in our country, the sort of prevalence of lynchings, particularly in the South, and sort of wondering kind of what is happening here in New York City with respect to that. How are Black people in the 8th Ward and in other parts of the city experiencing maybe a slightly higher level of physical safety? Like we talk about sort of Peggy and her family members sort of literally physically stepping back when they're interacting with a white couple in public. And so wondering kind of what is the experience of local Black people at that time with that level of with their level of physical safety?
I would say that Black New Yorkers during this time period are routinely talking about being particularly brutalized by the New York City police force at this time. In addition to what Dr. Harris brought up about the New York City draft riots in 1863, which was our city's worst episode of racial violence to date, you had Black New Yorkers ultimately leaving New York City, going to places like Brooklyn or elsewhere, right? And racial rioting continues to happen all the way up. Well, of course, but it happens in the 20th century as well. There's a race riot that happens in 1900 and 1905 as well that ultimately aids, in addition to landlords who are unwilling to rent to Black people, that push for Black New Yorkers to go further uptown, right? And so in 1900 and 1905, Black New Yorkers are primarily situated in the Tenderloin district. They're also living in a part of New York called San Juan Hill. And it's those race riots in 1900 and 1905 that make Black New Yorkers feel unsafe, and they ultimately go to Harlem seeking better opportunities. So Black New Yorkers, routinely talk about during this time, experiencing violence at the hands of the municipal police, and then also to just within other groups in New York at this time, whether they be, native-born white New Yorkers, different immigrant groups who are sort of antagonistic to Black New Yorkers. So that is a part of the experience as well.
Two more? Okay.
Yeah, okay. So my question was, I see that Miriam and Peggy are kind of like this friendship relationship, but throughout the show, we actually have conversations about women's rights. Like, if they have children, when they should have children, those type of relationships. And so I kind of wonder, how did you manage, or how does Peggy and Marion maybe manage the dynamic that even though they're both women, that there's still so much societal expectations on them? Like, for example, in the latest season, you know, it almost becomes a drama. It's like, oh, you used to be married, you had this other history surrounding you. You're no longer maybe like considered a quality wife and or woman, even though that had so much other context that had nothing to do with that family. But still, but even if a Miriam was maybe in that situation, it would still be somewhat scandalous because it was just not acceptable at the time. So I'm very curious to see like so many topics that they both kind of share, even though they're not the same skin color, but are still being kind of used against them on a societal level.
Yeah, I think that says a lot about their common shared class background as well. Perhaps slightly more aspiring, although I mean, Marion's family was a little downwardly mobile till they found some more money, so so you know they lucked out.
You say that.
But-
You say that to her. I gave you the money. Amy's back in the shoe episode. To take the train.
So, I mean, it says a lot about defining middle class values and morality, and so that is a link between them, and probably is one of the reasons why they can be friends, is because they have that understanding, rooted in religion, churches, even if they go to separate churches, and in education. I mean, all of that is wrapped up in education at the time. Yeah.
You know, I do think the difference between Marion and Peggy is that there's always an expectation that Peggy will work with her education. Yeah. You know, even her dad was hoping she would inherit the pharmacy, which was a path for Black professionals who didn't go to traditional education at that time. Like, he was able to leave enslavement and become a pharmacist, which is what Philip White did. But with Peggy, she was always going to be a professional in some way. Whereas with Marion, she's supposed to get married and be the profession of a socialite, right? And so that's why Agnes is so scandalized by her teaching and by Marion just having the dreams of having a job, period. And so there is sort of, I always look at it like Peggy ends up having a different kind of freedom almost to get to move towards her ambitions because she's not under like the shackles of white womanhood, where like at that time, there were white people who didn't even really see Black women as women. Like, we didn't really get to hold that title of femininity. And so there's almost a kind of liberation within that Marion doesn't quite have because of the expectation that she'll marry higher up and become a wife, you know?
In our last moments, I wanted to ask each of you if there's something that you wanted to say about this topic that we didn't get to, or we went off track and you said, oh, I wanted to make sure I said that. Marquis, is there anything that you really wanted to say about the Gilded Age, about Peggy Scott's New York, about the 8th Ward?
I mean, one of the things which is a recurring theme, and we see it talked about in the Gilded Age, thinking about Peggy's role as an educator, but often I give tours at the Museum for Union of Hope, and that one of the things that we have is a vitrine of items that belong to a Black New Yorker whose name was Gina Manuel, and these objects belong to her great-grandmother, who was a Black woman who lived in New York during this time period. And she actually went to a Black school that was not too far from NYU. And in that vitrine, we have books that belong to her. So we have books by Shakespeare. We have speeches and addresses by Abraham Lincoln. We have a lot of books from Gina Manuel and her family. And one of the things that surprise visitors often is the rates of literacy in the Black community at this time. They're astonished and they can't believe that students were reading this work. And it is by and large because of the role of Black women educators in New York at this time, which is something that we've talked about, but I wanted to reinforce that, is that we, in addition to the stories that we see, Denée play through Peggy and the work of other historians who are uncovering this work, is that we actually have physical items that support this assertion that Black people were literate and that they were educated through things like the colored school system at the time, and earlier its predecessor, the African Free School. So,
Leslie, anything you wanted to say?
I just want to say how grateful I am to the show for putting things on screen that I've never seen before, and a shout out to my colleague and friend Erica Dunbar for when I was in the middle of watching season 3, I just texted her like, you got that into this show? And then we had to have a 3-hour conversation. So I just think it's amazing. I never even knew to expect some of the storylines that are there, and it's amazing. It's wonderful. It's an amazing thing. So thank you. That's all I have to say about the Gilded Age.
Oh, I want to be on
love
your
it.
text chain with Erica Dunbar. And Faye, what do you have to say, Denee? Anything special that you wanted to say tonight?
I think, yeah, I think back to 2019 and I just knew that we had the chance to do something that hadn't been done before. And I knew how much it would mean to us as a community. And I think it's been really special to feel how much it's meant to the collective. Like people of all races, genders, ages feel so invested in our world. And I think that one of my mentors talks about remembering as a sacred act. Like it's not just in your brain, it's like putting pieces of a form back together. And I think about like us collectively as a consciousness, so much of the erasure that happens in history and why they're attacking it now is to kind of gaslight us out of these truths all the time. And so I just think it's special to get to come together with other excited nerds about this stuff because that's how I feel, and I'm excited to be a vessel for it amongst my people.
Marquis Taylor, Leslie Harris, and Denee Benton, thank you so much for coming out.